Hey guys, tonight we're going to talk about bread. Not the crusty hipster sourdough you might find on a wooden board next to a poached egg. No, we're talking about the bread of medieval Europe, coarse, suspiciously gray, and sometimes slowly lethal. Imagine this. You're wandering home at dusk through the muddy paths of a 14th century village, a round loaf tucked under your arm. It's still warm from the communal oven, steam rising into the evening air. It smells like toasted earth, maybe with a hint of ash. You're tired, you're hungry, and you're already dreaming of tearing off a piece. But here's the twist. There's a chance that this innocent-looking loaf is laced with something sinister. Not poison slipped in by an enemy, not even spoiled grain, but a natural contaminant that no one really understands yet, something that might give you blisters, visions, or worse. A very slow, very painful death, because medieval bread could kill you. Slowly, secretly. And the worst part? Everyone kept eating it anyway. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you genuinely enjoy what I do here. Also, I'd love to know where you're tuning in from tonight, and what time it is where you will redrop it in the comments. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan for that soft background hum, and let's ease into tonight's journey together. You're poor. That's important to clarify up front. Not peasant in a picture book porno. You're working the fields from dawn to dusk poor. Your hands are calloused, and your stomach's constantly half empty. The only thing you can count on most days is bread. Not meat, not butter, just bread. And the bread is, well, it's not great. You chew through gritty lumps of blackish rye, which clings to your teeth like wet sand. You get maybe 2 meals a day, both centered around this heavy, dry lump. Sometimes you dunk it in a broth that tastes vaguely like turnip. On rare feast days, you smear it with pig fat or old cheese. And if it smells a bit earthy, a little sharp, a little sour, a little like you left a dish sponge in the cellar, that's just life. You eat it anyway. You don't know it, but this loaf could be infected with Claviceps purpurea parasitic fungus that grows on rye and barley. We call it ergot now. Back then, it was just bad bread. You'd never see it growing in the fields at least not clearly. It looks like blackened kernels, shaped like claws or goat horns, tucked in among the golden grains. Most millers didn't bother to pick it out. It was tedious. People were hungry, and the flour was already coarse, uneven, and speckled with debris. What was a little fungus in the mix? If you're lucky, the loaf just gives you stomach cramps and a bad dream. If not, the symptoms come slowly. First, a tingling in your fingers. Then your feet start to burn. Your hands cramp. You can't feel the tips of your fingers anymore. The village priest calls it fire from heaven. The pain gets worse, hot, itching, like your limbs are full of embers. Then the blisters start. The skin blackens. Fingers rot. Toes drop off. Historians still argue whether all these symptoms came from ergot or from several overlapping medieval horrors, but the overlap is telling. One thing's for sure, bread was never just bread. It was a gamble. Even the name they gave it, St. Anthony's Fire, sounds medievally dramatic, doesn't it? You might stumble toward a shrine, hoping the monks will take you in. There, among other victims, your limbs wrapped in bandages, you lie on straw, whispering prayers through clenched teeth. Some survive, some don't. No one understands why. And the strangest part? No one blames the bread. They blame your sins. The devil, the wind, that strange woman near the edge of town. But never the loaf. You ate it yesterday. You'll eat it tomorrow. Because there's nothing else. And not all loaves are created equal. In the wealthier homes, they bake with wheat. White, fluffy, precious wheat. The aristocrats don't eat your bread. They don't burn from the inside out. They never feel their legs erupt into fire under the moonlight. They look down at your blackened feet, shake their powdered heads, and talk about divine punishment. You might die, slowly, painfully, from a sandwich, but they'll never know what that's like. So tonight, as you settle into your straw mattress, your stomach full, but not quite satisfied, you think of tomorrow's loaf. You hope the miller was careful. You hope the oven was hot enough. You hope the rye didn't grow in the wrong patch of soil. And then you drift off into sleep, dreaming of wheat you'll never taste. You wake up stiff. Your back complains. Your shoulders ache. And your feet itch with yesterday's mud. The sun's barely poked over the thatched roofs, but already the village is creaking to life. Chickens cluck. Someone's chopping wood. And down by the fields, a few early risers are checking on the grain. Because if there's one thing that determines your year, it's the harvest. Now, let's get this clear. You don't stroll into a grocery store. You don't pick between 10 kinds of bread or check for gluten-free options. Your bread is your grain. No grain? No bread. No bread? No food. And these medieval fields, they're not the postcard kind. The soil is patchy. Some of it's hard as packed stone. Some so soft your boots disappear into it. You rely on luck, the rain, and maybe a saint's goodwill. You're growing rye, barley, and oats, because wheat, the soft, luxurious darling of bread making, doesn't grow well in your region. It needs better land, fewer weeds, and you have neither. You rotate your crops, sort of. Some years you leave a field fallow to let it rest. But this is more ritual than science. You scatter the seeds, hope the sun shines, hope the rats don't get too bold, and most of all, hope the rot stays away. Ah, yes, the rot. Ergot loves cool, damp springs followed by warm summers. Basically, the exact weather pattern your village gets most years. When it's wet, the fungus takes hold. When it's warm, it spreads. You can't see it from the edge of the field. It blends in. The difference between a good kernel and a deadly one is subtle, and most of you wouldn't know what to look for anyway. And then there are the rats. Yes, rats. Because before the bread ever reaches your mouth, it has to pass through the ancient, creaking logistics of medieval storage. Grain is piled into sacks, then into barns, where it sits and waits. Sometimes it waits through rain, sometimes through rats, often through mold. There are no silos, no refrigeration, just wooden beams, thatch, and desperate hope. You've seen what happens when someone forgets to dry the harvest properly. The bread made from that grain smells sour. It bakes funny uneven, heavy in the center. You chew it and your tongue tingles slightly. You cough a bit more. You pretend you didn't notice. Historians still argue whether villagers were aware of the risks of spoiled grain. Some say they were, pointing to herbal cleansing rituals and the habit of discarding oddly shaped loaves. Others argue they simply couldn't afford to care. You're not throwing out a year's food because it smells funny. You eat. You survive. And that brings us to the curious case of grain purging. You've heard tales. Some households, especially those near monasteries, soaking their rye before grinding it. They say it washes out the bad spirits. It all sound beknownst to them, can remove some surface spores, but it's not consistent. Others will toast the grains before milling, which might kill off certain fungi, or not. Again, there's no science, just ritual, rumor, and inherited habits. Today, you walk the fields with your neighbor, Tomas. He's squinting at the stalks, trying to guess when to harvest. Too soon, and the grain's underdeveloped. Too late, and the fungus sets in deeper. You suggest next week. He mutters about a storm coming. You both know it's a gamble. You both also know that losing a harvest doesn't just mean hunger. It means sickness. It means dead children. It means another winter where the snow feels like a slow knife. Later, you pass by the village mill. It creaks, as always, the wheels spinning in its sluggish rhythm. The miller waves you off. He's got no time for chatting. His grindstones are busy, and his mood is foul. The grindstones, by the way, are rarely cleaned. They collect bits of old flour, old rot. You'd think it would matter. It doesn't. No one wants to stop the flow of food. You glance back once more, at the fields bent, over like praying hands. They shimmer in the late morning sun. They look beautiful. But beauty lies. That rye might already be cursed. The bread tastes different today. You notice it with the first bite, just a flicker of bitterness, a sharpness along the roof of your mouth. The crust is harder than usual, the crumb inside dense and damp, as if it wasn't baked long enough. But it's still bread, still warm, still filling. So you chew and swallow and keep going. This is rye bread. Not because you like rye. You eat it because you're not rich. Wheat is for nobles. Rye is for everyone else. And here's the thing about rye. It's an incredibly hardy grain. It grows even when the soil is tired, even when the weather is moody, even when weeds fight for every inch of space. It's the survivor of medieval grains. But survival comes at a price. You see, rye has a weakness: an intimate, centuries-old relationship with a tiny, deadly fungus. And it doesn't take much ergot to do damage. Just a few black kernels slipping through the mill, ground down into flour, scattered through a batch of dough. No smell, no warning, just poison baked at 450 degrees. You tear off another hunk, dunk it in broth, and try not to think about it. Historians still argue whether the peasants truly distinguished between a bad loaf and a bad omen. Many were illiterate, but that didn't mean they were stupid. Some families would quietly avoid eating a loaf that felt wrong: too purple, too chewy, too slick on the tongue. Others chalked it up to God's will, or the changing of the seasons. A few, especially women who baked for many households, learned to spot certain signs: odd speckles in the flour, gray smudges in the dough, an unnatural shine. But this knowledge wasn't written down. It wasn't taught in schools. It passed from grandmother to granddaughter, or not at all. And even if you knew, what would you do? Throw it away? You made that loaf from the last of your flour. Your neighbor lent you firewood to heat the oven. The wind last night knocked down part of the barn roof. Your cousin is coughing blood again. This is survival bread. Even if it whispers danger, you eat it anyway. Meanwhile, in the manor house up the hill, they're slicing into wheat bread. It's light, soft, almost spongy. A mild sweetness lingers in the crust, kissed by honey and a touch of milk. They don't use rye not because they understand ergot, but because they find rye coarse, common, peasant food. Their bread is made from fine milled wheat, sieved 3 times, baked in private ovens by trained cooks. It's pulled from iron pans, served on silver platters, sometimes even scented with herbs. Bread as art, as status, as softness. But even they aren't completely safe. Because wheat, too, can grow infected, especially if it's stored poorly. Some noble families, despite their privileges, report sudden fevers, stomach-twisting pain, or moments of hallucination. The doctor arrives in black robes, muttering about humors and offering leeches. No one suspects the fresh roll on the breakfast tray. There's one strange twist, though. Ergot can make you feel good before it makes you feel awful. You've heard the stories. Some villagers eat a bad loaf and report vivid dreams floating above their beds, seeing angels in the rafters, giggling for no reason under the stars. One woman danced for an hour straight in the square, laughing until she cried. Then her legs went numb. Then she screamed. The hallucinations are real. The fungus contains alkaloids similar to LSD. Imagine chewing on a toasted sandwich and suddenly believing you're flying. Medieval medicine had no explanation for this. They blamed possession, bad air, and witches. Always witches. You take another bite. It's better this time. Or maybe you're getting used to it. The bread grits between your teeth. Sometimes it crunches tiny bits of stone from the grindstone itself. You wonder if that's why your molars hurt. Why the old folks in town are toothless by 40. Bread wears you down, inside and out. Still, you finish your meal. It's all you have. And tomorrow, you'll do it again. The tingling begins in your toes. It's faint at first, barely worth noting. A pins and needles sort of numbness that creeps up when you've been standing too long in wet boots. But this time it doesn't fade when you stretch or move. It lingers. Later that evening, your fingers start to cramp as you knead dough. A dull heat pulses in your palms, and you rub them on your apron, pretending it's nothing. Maybe it's just the cold, or maybe you slept on your arm wrong. But deep down, people whisper about the burning. They don't say the word ergot, of course. That's centuries away. They call it St. Anthony's fire, a name that manages to sound both holy and terrifying. The symptoms vary. Sometimes you burn, sometimes you convulse, sometimes your skin turns black and falls away in dry, papery chunks. Sometimes you hallucinate, other times you lose entire limbs. You've seen it before. Last year, the baker's youngest son, Timothy, maybe 10, ate a moldy crust too many. First he itched, then he cried, then his foot turned black, and the priest came. They said prayers. They wrapped it in herbs. His leg was gone by winter. The monks from the Order of St. Anthony have a hospital 2 villages over. They're known for treating the fire, or at least making it less unbearable. Pilgrims crawl there, hoping for a miracle, dragging blistered limbs behind them. The monks feed them blessed bread, wheat bread, made by their own hands, from untainted stores. Not cheap, not for everyone. You picture the monastery now. Tall stone walls, the smell of rosemary and beeswax, candles flickering in high, narrow windows. You'd rather not go there. People who go often don't return. Historians still argue whether the monks understood what caused the fire, or if they just stumbled upon cleaner grain and safer ovens. Either way, their bread was better. Safer. Sacred. Meanwhile, yours was still a coin toss every morning. The tingling sharpens. You lie in bed, staring at the thatch above, watching a spider inch across the beams. Your legs ache. Your stomach turns. You feel heat behind your eyes, not fever, but the thick press of worry. You think of the loaf you saved for tomorrow. It sits in the corner, wrapped in cloth, looking perfectly normal. Maybe that's the worst part. There's no way to know. No visible mold, no foul scent, just warm, comforting bread, and somewhere inside, the seeds of your own undoing. Earlier today, you passed the baker's shop. You watched as she scraped the last of the dough from the mixing bowl, wiped her hands on her apron, and stoked the fire. Her daughter, barely taller than the kneading bench, played with a crust like a doll, singing to it in a broken tune. The oven is shared by the village. Most of you bring your own dough, shaped and scored, waiting for your turn. You mark your loaf with a symbol, a tiny cut in the crust, so you know which one's yours when the flames die down. But there's no rule against cross-contamination. If one household's flour was spoiled, it might mingle with the next. The paddle scrapes the ash from one loaf and slides it straight under yours. Nobody washes anything. There's no time. There's always a line. You think about this as the tingling climbs your calves. You think about your neighbors. Who else ate from that same oven today? Who else is lying awake right now, staring at the same spider, feeling the same creeping heat? You shift beneath the thin wool blanket. Try to breathe slower. It helps. A little. Tomorrow, you'll go to the market and ask around. Discreetly. You don't want to start rumors, but you need to know. Did anyone else get a bad loaf? Did anyone else feel odd? Maybe it's not the bread. Maybe you're just tired. Maybe the tingling is from the field work. Maybe the cramps are from weaving too long in a cold room. Maybe. But then again, maybe this is how it begins. Morning brings no relief. The tingling in your legs has dulled, but not disappeared. Your hands are stiff. You stretch them slowly, listening to your knuckles crack. Maybe it was just the cold. That's what you tell yourself. You don't tell anyone else. Not yet. Instead, you shuffle toward the oven with the day's new dough. The air is thick with smoke, and the bricks radiate leftover heat from the early risers. A couple of women stand in line ahead of you, baskets slung over their arms, chatting about the weather. A sick goat, someone's niece who ran off to be a nun. Nobody talks about bread. Nobody ever says, "Did your loaf turn bitter?" Or, "Did your daughter's fingers go numb after supper?" Not openly, not in public. The woman in front of you, Marta, turns and offers a thin smile. Her teeth are yellowed, her eyes tired. She nods at your dough. "Looks good," she says. "Smells strong," you reply. She chuckles, then looks away. Because everyone knows, but no one knows. The loaf from yesterday is still on your shelf. You didn't eat the second half. It sits there, mocking you with its perfectly ordinary crust. Part of you wants to feed it to the chickens, see if they start dancing. Part of you wants to bury it. And then there's the fire. Not the baking fire. The burning. It started again. Low in your fingers. A slow heat that coils like a match being lit under your skin. You shake your hands out and pretend to scratch your wrist. You focus on the oven, the smell of yeast and ash, the snap of a log collapsing into coals. People talk about St. Anthony's fire as though it's a test, a divine punishment, a fever of the soul. But you've seen too much to believe that. Last winter, a whole village 4 miles east lost 7 children in 1 week. Their limbs turned black and shriveled. One mother claimed her baby began screaming before he even touched the bread just from the smell. They said it was a curse. The priest did a cleansing. Nothing helped. Historians still argue whether these symptoms were always caused by ergot, or if medieval records lumped every rash, seizure, or phantom pain under the same banner. The accounts are vague, written in trembling script by candlelight. "He burned from within," one reads. "She danced through the storm until she collapsed." Not exactly medical diagnosis, but patterns emerge. Rye, rainy springs, poor storage, sudden illness. In the church? The church gets involved. You've heard the rumors. Some parishes now bless the grain before milling. Others place a small charm in the flour bean, a tiny cross, a feather, a sliver of bone said to belong to a saint. Superstition? Maybe. But when every third household on your street is limping or coughing blood, you're willing to try anything. Today, after baking, you head toward the chapel, not for confession, not even for prayer. You just want to see if anyone else looks pale. You pass a woman near the font, her hands trembling as she dips them in holy water. An old man sits by the wall, whispering to himself, clutching his chest. You recognize those symptoms. Later, in the market square, you spot a child barefoot, legs covered in strange welts, hopping awkwardly, as if his feet can't bear his weight. His mother tugs him along quickly. She doesn't meet anyone's eyes. No one speaks of it aloud, but the village knows. And like you, they just keep baking. That night, you do something you haven't done in weeks. You throw away a loaf. You carry it out behind the cottage, into the woods near the edge of your plot. You dig a small hole. It feels dramatic, almost theatrical. You expect lightning, or a fox to come sniffing. Instead, the bread just sits there in the dirt. Damp. Quiet. The crust still intact. You bury it and walk away. When you lie down, your hands still ache, but at least you didn't eat it. The village oven hisses and steams as you slide your next loaf in. It's hotter today, the fire snapping louder than usual, and the stone floor smells of scorched ash and old dough. You watch your bread darken through the heat. No thermostat, no timer, just instinct and timing, and a prayer it won't burn or rot from the inside. This isn't your oven. It belongs to everyone. The village shares 1 or 2 communal ovens, and you wait your turn like everyone else. Each household arrives with its dough marked by a sigil, 3 slashes for the carters, a little triangle for the widow at the edge of town, a clover for your family. Once baked, the loaves all look roughly the same. Round, dark, hard as fence posts, You rely on those marks to find yours, but there's something unsettling about this process. Everyone's flour comes from the same mill, the same sacks, the same stones. If one family's grain is tainted moldy, ergot laced, chewed by rats, it all goes into the same air, the same bench, the same fire. You watch as a man with soot-blackened hands uses the same paddle to shuffle loaves across the ash. No rinsing, no wiping. Just crusts scraping against crusts. It's not intentional. It's just how things are. You nod politely to the baker's wife, who's stacking cooling loaves on a rough wooden shelf. She's wiping her brow with flour-covered hands. Her apron is streaked with dough. You notice a loaf on the end of the line that looks off its crust oddly shiny, like it was rubbed with oil. Maybe honey? Maybe worse? You don't ask. Because asking means starting something. And in a small village, once someone gets labeled suspicious, there's no going back. You wait. You collect your bread. You walk home with it, warm and weighty in your arms. Historians still argue whether communal baking helped spread ergot poisoning or limited it. On one hand, centralizing the baking might mean fewer contaminated batches. On the other hand, one tainted loaf could infect a dozen households if the tools and surfaces weren't clean. And medieval ovens were never clean. The baker's paddle is old, made of splintered wood, crusted with years of char. It's passed from hand to hand. The benches where dough rests before baking are wiped with rags that haven't seen water since spring. The mixing bowls are communal, too, in many poorer homes. That means flour touched by one family's hands might carry mold, sweat, or even rat droppings into yours. But it gets worse, because sometimes you don't even grind your own grain. You trade for it, or you borrow flour from your neighbor. Maybe it's already milled, already bagged, already hiding secrets. Once, when you were younger, you borrowed flour from the old woman who lived near the river. Her grain had a strange smell, bitter, like crushed nettles. But you used it anyway. That winter, your mother's legs went numb. She never walked the same again. Of course, you can't prove anything. No one can. And then there's the water. Yes, water matters. You mix your dough with water from the village well. Or sometimes, if it's raining, from the barrel outside your door. No one filters it. Why would they? You need it to bind the dough, to make the rye less brittle, to help it rise. But sometimes that water carries rot, or spores, or whatever else lives in a wooden barrel left uncovered for weeks. The fire can't kill everything. Not when the spores are already embedded in the flour, the dough, the crust itself. You could bake a loaf until it's black, and it might still poison you. You remember a neighbor, years ago, who tried to scrape off the crust of every loaf. Said it was safer. She died anyway. Sometimes it's not about the crust. Sometimes it's just the luck of the slice. That evening, you serve your bread to your brother. He chews slowly, grimacing. Tastes sharp, he says. You shrug. Could be the salt. But you didn't add salt. You never do. That night, you wake to shouting. Voices carry down the muddy road, urgent but not panicked. Just loud enough to make you sit up. Your blanket slipping from your shoulders, your pulse already ahead of you. You pull on your cloak and step outside. It's Marta's son, the boy with the quiet voice and soft eyes. He's in the square, arms flailing like a puppet with tangled strings. He's spinning, barefoot, babbling nonsense. His legs jerking in unnatural rhythms, as if music only he can hear is pounding through his veins. You've seen this before. Not often, but enough. He's dancing, not the joyful kind, not the kind with fiddles or clapping. This is the dance that comes from inside, from something that doesn't belong in the body. The boy whirls, laughing and sobbing at once. His mother tries to catch him, but he slips past, spinning wildly through the wet grass, crashing into a cart. It's dancing mania. A few villagers look on, murmuring prayers. Others edge away. No one wants to get too close. This isn't the kind of illness you touch. The baker crosses herself. The priest arrives in silence. A man grabs the boy's shoulders, and the child collapses mid-turn, sobbing into the dirt. You step back, because you remember the stories. They come from faraway Germany, the Low Countries, even parts of France. Whole towns struck at once, dozens, sometimes hundreds, dancing without rest, leaping, flailing, convulsing in the streets. Some die from exhaustion. Others keep going for days. The afflicted move like puppets, limbs jerking in unnatural ways, eyes wide, mouths open in voiceless song. Historians still debate the cause. Was it ergot poisoning? Some think so. The hallucinations, the muscle spasms, the strange trance-like state it fits. Others argue for mass hysteria, trauma, a kind of communal breakdown in a world full of starvation, plague, and fear. But in your village, people don't argue. They know. It's the bread. You remember your own loaf, the one you buried days ago. What if Marta didn't bury hers? What if her flour came from the same sack as yours? You traded with her last week, lent her a bit of salt, borrowed some barley in return. The connections tighten in your mind like a noose. The priest speaks softly to the boy's mother. She nods, tearful, clutching her son's twitching hand. He stopped dancing, but his limbs still jerk every few moments like an echo of the frenzy. Later, the priest sprinkles the square with holy water. Some say that helps. You doubt it. The bread's already inside. You return home and sit by the embers of the hearth, the last of your fire glowing low. Your brother is asleep, his chest rising in slow, even waves. You think of his comment, the sharp taste, and suddenly, your stomach tightens. You fight the urge to be sick. You glance at the bread on the shelf. You're not hungry. Still, you feel it low in your belly, a tightness that wasn't there before. That night, your dreams are strange. You walk through a forest of rye, the stalks tall as men, the sky bruised purple. The bread you buried crawls out of the soil, sprouting legs like beetles. In the distance, you hear flutes, faint and shrill, and you start to dance, but your feet move without your consent. You wake up tangled in your blanket, heart hammering, and for a moment, your legs twitch. The next morning, the village is quieter than usual. You notice it in the way the chickens don't quite cluck as loudly, and how the baker's door creaks open later than it should. The air feels thick like it's holding its breath. You cross paths with Marta again. Her eyes are red. Her son is home, resting, she says. Resting, but not talking, not blinking quite right. And the loaf she was going to bake? She burned it. On purpose. You don't ask why. You know why. Today is the weekly milling day, when people from your end of the village walk to the watermill, sacks slung over their shoulders, grumbling about the weight and the weight. You fall in line behind old Garrick, who carries his grain in a cloth that's seen better decades. He smells faintly of mildew and onions. The mill looms ahead, wooden and slightly tilted, like it's trying to bow politely but forgot how. The wheel churns lazily in the stream. Inside, the grinding stones growl like stomachs, turning rye into flour, flour into fate. The miller, Tom, is a wiry man with gray teeth and suspiciously clean fingernails. He never seems to touch the flour somehow. Always points, never scoops. His two sons do the heavy work hauling, lifting, grinding. One is missing a thumb. The other has a glassy eye. You suspect neither are unrelated to flour accidents. You hand over your rye, and the older son dumps it into the hopper. Dust explodes into the air. You instinctively hold your breath. You try not to look at the black specks swirling through the sunbeam. Just flecks of dirt, you tell yourself. Just harmless chaff. But part of you wonders. You've heard stories about millers. Some say they dilute your grain with someone else's. Others say they skim the best of it for themselves and replace it with something older, wetter, grayer. Some accuse them of cutting flour with powdered bark or chalk. One woman swore she found a mouse skull in her flour bag. Bread fraud is real. In some towns, it's a punishable offense. Fines, imprisonment, even flogging. But in the countryside, things are looser. No one audits the mill. The miller is one of you, and you need him. If you accuse him, and he refuses your grain next time, you go hungry. So you smile, nod, and wait. The bag you get back feels lighter. Maybe it's just your imagination. Maybe not. You sling it over your shoulder and head home. Historians still argue how widespread mill fraud really was. In urban centers, there were rules, inspections, seals, fines. In rural villages, it was mostly built on trust, or desperation, or silence. And when silence is your default, bad grain slips into the mix without anyone saying a word. Back home, you notice something new. A boy at the edge of the village has a rash, angry red spots on his arms. His mother wraps them in cabbage leaves and hums a lullaby. No one mentions bread, but you're watching now, watching closely. You start to wonder, who's next? At supper, your brother doesn't eat much, says his mouth feels funny. His words are slurred. He blames the cider. You nod and pretend to agree, but you're already watching his fingers show he flexes them. How he keeps rubbing his temple. And that new flour? You haven't baked with it yet. It sits untouched in a cool corner, tied off with twine, as if it's ticking. Later that night, you overhear Marta whispering to the priest. She wants to accuse someone. Someone brought something bad into the flour bin, she says. She won't name names, not yet. But she's certain. Her eyes are wild. Her hands shake. She speaks of signs show the dog won't go near the oven, how the bread crackled in the night. You duck out of earshot, because you know what comes next. Once the whispers begin, someone always pays. A strange thing happens the next morning. The village baker doesn't open her shutters. No bread smells drift into the square. No smoke curls from the oven chimney. A few people knock softly at her door and wait. Nothing. You walk past on your way to fetch water and glance at the quiet windows. The curtain twitches, just once. You say nothing, because you know what she's thinking. The talk has started. Not open accusations, yet no shouting, no stones. Just murmurs. Her flour was always too light, someone says. She never blessed her grain. Her daughter's always pale, have you noticed? And you realize, with a cold knot in your stomach, what's about to happen. In times like this, when bread turns against the body, someone must be to blame. Sometimes it's the miller. Sometimes the woman who sells herbs. Sometimes the quiet one near the stream, who walks alone and wears odd trinkets. Sometimes the baker. It's rarely the bread itself. You stop at the chapel for water, and the priest meets your gaze for a moment too long. He knows the fear is spreading. He knows how quickly fear starts pointing fingers. You notice he's placed a loaf on the altar, white bread. Blessed, untouched. A symbol, or a warning. You sit on the chapel bench, letting the cool stones seep into your legs. You think about how many bad loaves you've eaten, how many slices you didn't question, how many batches passed from hand to hand, baked, broken, shared like communion with consequences. In the past, when people began to sicken, the church sometimes stepped in. Parish records tell of bread examinations, clergy inspecting loaves for signs of spoilage. Sometimes they even tasted it themselves. Brave, foolish, historians still argue. In one case, a bishop supposedly died after sampling contaminated rye to prove it was safe. His martyrdom was not especially encouraging. You wander through the market later, and everyone is looking over their shoulders. The flour seller is suddenly very vocal about his sourcing. Wheat only, he shouts. No rye, no risk. You don't believe him. One man sharpens a blade on the stoop, not because he's baking, but because fear has teeth. You remember a village 5 winters ago where things got out of hand. They hanged a woman from a tree near the crossroads after 3 children died in 1 week. They said she cursed the grain. They burned her millstone in a fire. A week later, more fell ill. No one spoke of it again. This is how it begins. The bread sours. The air thickens. and suspicion settles like dust over every doorstep. That evening, you bake anyway. You clean the bowl carefully, scrub the wood table with salt water. You knead slowly, your hands aching. You bless the dough softly, with the sign your grandmother taught you, just a finger tap to the center and a whispered wish. Your loaf goes into the oven alongside 3 others. You know the marks. You know their bakers. You don't know their grain. When it comes out, it's perfect, warm, even. The crust sings as it cools. "Butyuhesitate." Your brother watches you across the table. He's pale. He hasn't touched food all day. He looks like someone who doesn't want to ask if the bread is safe. You break off a piece and hand it to him. He holds it for a long time. Neither of you eat. Outside, the wind rises. The shutters creak. And far across the village, someone screams. Spring was always the most beautiful time to die. At least, that's what the old women said. The grass was soft again. The air smelled of damp earth and lilac. And the birds came back, chirping like nothing was wrong. A peaceful time to let go. And, unfortunately, the time when bread killed most often. You trudge through the village path, crusty loaf under your arm, sunlight warm on your shoulders. The fields glow golden green in the distance. It looks like healing, but you know better. This right now is the most dangerous time of year. See, it's not winter that gets you. In winter, the bread is dry, old, dusty. Sometimes moldy, yes, but in a different way. A slow, visible rot that you can break off and toss to the pigs. But in late spring, that's when the new grain from last season finally runs out. The good sacks are gone. What's left at the bottom is damp, soft, forgotten, maybe gnawed by rats, maybe laced with a bit of rainwater that dripped down through the rafters. The perfect home for ergot to bloom. And yet, you bake. You always bake. The hunger is sharper this time of year. The fresh greens haven't come in yet. The dried meat is long gone, and every belly in the village echoes like a drum. You need bread now more than ever, just when it's most likely to betray you. Historians have a name for this: the hungry gap. That dangerous stretch between last year's harvest and the first new crops. Most modern people have never experienced it. You live inside it, yearly. During the hungry gap, mothers grow pale, children shrink. The old ones stop talking as much. You notice it in your brother. He moves slower. The sharpness behind his eyes has dulled. He hasn't mentioned the loaf you offered last night. It still sits on the table uncut, cooling, gathering dust. And you're afraid to throw it away. Because what if it's still good? The wind today carries smells: burned crust, damp grass, the faint acidic scent of turned milk. Someone's cooking broth too thin to matter. And beneath it all, you catch the scent of something wrong. Not strong, not clear. Just the ghost of mold, hiding behind the yeasty warmth of a freshly baked round. You pretend not to notice. The priest is performing blessings again today. You pass him near the crossroads, where villagers gather with their loaves wrapped in linen. One by one, they hand them over. He murmurs a Latin phrase, makes the sign of the cross, and gives them back. He doesn't look closely, doesn't ask questions. You wonder how many of the loaves are truly safe. You wonder if he knows which ones will kill. Historians still debate whether spring bread deaths were always due to ergot, or if malnutrition played the larger role. Some argue that starvation made symptoms worse. Others point to year-by-year records that correlate wet springs with outbreaks of burning limbs, purple skin, and phantom insects crawling under the flesh. Chilling, handwritten phrases from forgotten clerks. What's not debated? People kept eating, even after the fires in their legs, even after the convulsions, the vomiting, the whispers. They kept eating. Because hunger doesn't care what killed the last man. Hunger only wants one thing. And now, standing in your kitchen, watching the bread cool on the table, you realize how fragile your world has become. It all rests on a crust. You hear a knock at the door. It's Marta again. Her hands tremble as she holds out a wrapped bundle. I baked too much, she says too quickly. For my sister. But she's ill. Will you take it? You hesitate. Your loaf sits untouched. Hers is warm. You nod. She sets it down. You both say nothing. And as she turns to leave, you notice the scratch on her arm. Thin, fresh, ringed in red. You don't touch the loaf. Not right away. You stare at it for a while, wrapped in rough linen, still faintly warm, smelling faintly of ash and something else. Something bitter underneath, like wilted violets or rotting hay. Not strong enough to be certain. Just wrong enough to hesitate. You try to distract yourself. You sweep the floor. You feed the chickens. You patch the corner of the roof where the rain got in last week. But every time you pass the table, your eyes return to that bundle, and to the memory of Marta's arm. The scratch was small, angry red, the kind you get from brambles or cats, but it had a purplish edge, a little too wide, a little too fresh. You try not to think about the boy, her son. He hasn't been outside in 3 days now. You haven't heard him laugh, or cry, or even speak. That's not normal. And you remember what the priest said 2 winters ago, when something similar passed through the village. Rot of the soul, he called it. It enters through the mouth. You unwrap the bread carefully, like opening a secret. The crust is firm, well-baked, slightly cracked near the edge. A clover carved into the top their family's mark. You sniff again. It smells mostly fine. Mostly, but you know better now. You slice it open, slow, your knife dragging slightly in the dense crumb. It's darker than yours. Not quite purple, not quite gray. Something in between. You put it down. Because today, you've decided to be careful. The problem is, the village isn't. Bread continues to pass from hand to hand. Traded, gifted, blessed, sold. It's more than food. It's currency. It's proof of labor, of care, of survival. Not eating someone's loaf is almost an insult. Refusing it? Dangerous. And then there are the rumors. The priest has started asking questions. Quietly. Gently. One widow swore her daughter convulsed after sharing a loaf with a herb woman by the stream. The herb woman, of course, denies it. But her oven is cold this morning. No smoke. No baking. Someone else claims to have found black horns in their flour bag. Ergot. But they don't call it that. They just say the rot, or devil grain. Historians still argue whether medieval villagers understood the link between the black kernels and the sickness. Some sources suggest yes, they called it spur or cockspur, and avoided the darkest grains. Others say the connection was unclear, buried under layers of religious blame and fear. But either way, fear is growing. People start attending Mass more regularly. Not out of piety, out of terror. They bring their loaves with them, pressing them into the priest's hands like offerings. One man clutches a roll so tightly, it crumbles in his fingers. And then, the inevitable happens. Someone accuses. It's whispered first, then spoken aloud. The herb woman. They say she cursed the flower. They say her garden never rots, even in rain. They say she keeps bones under her bed. The miller nods silently, not denying it. He has nothing to lose and everything to gain by shifting blame. The crowd doesn't need proof, just a story. You watch from your doorway as they march toward her home. A line of villagers with tense faces and empty hands. They don't bring torches, not yet, but someone carries a rope. You turn away. This isn't justice. It's fear made flesh. That night, you bury Marta's loaf. You don't tell her. You walk to the edge of the woods again. Dig with your hands. Lay the bread in the earth like a body. You say no words. You cover it in silence. And as you walk home, you wonder if you'll be next. You wake to bells, slow, measured, echoing through the village, like a heartbeat that doesn't want to go on. It's not the feast day. It's not Sunday. These are not the joyful bells of harvest or marriage. These are the bells of death. Someone has died. You dress quietly, not bothering with breakfast. The bread still sits untouched, and you're too sick of guessing whether it will feed you or finish you. Your brother is asleep, or pretending. His eyes stay closed a little too long when you glance his way. His skin is pale. You say nothing. Outside, people drift toward the chapel like dust being pulled toward a draft. Martha's son. You hear it before you see it. He died sometime before dawn. In his sleep, they say. But his hands were curled into claws, his legs stiff and straight. The body, someone whispers, was warm long after it should have cooled. You don't ask what he ate. The burial is swift. The priest says the words. The others murmur them back. A handful of dirt is tossed. A cross is planted. And then everyone turns back toward the village. No one speaks to Marta. She doesn't cry. She just stands beside the grave with her face like stone. The fear is no longer subtle now. The baker's shutters stay shut. The herb woman is gone. No one says where. But her home has been ransacked. Her garden trampled. A scorch mark near the back suggests someone tried to burn something, maybe herbs, maybe something else. And the bread keeps baking. You go to market later and see a man selling tiny loaves shaped like crosses. Blessed by the priest himself, he claims. They cost double. People still buy them. One woman swears she'll never eat rye again. Another mutters that even wheat isn't safe anymore. A third says she's fasting until midsummer. You nod, make noises of agreement, and walk away. You pass the mill. Tom is still there, but his sons are quiet. One of them keeps rubbing his leg and limping slightly. You think about the dust in the air, the sacks piled too close to the damp wall, the heap of cast-off kernels growing black at the base of the millstone. And you think about your own body. You've lost weight. Everyone has. But your fingers ache more than they should. You dream strange things, now flames licking at your toes, insects crawling under your skin. In your dreams, you keep chewing, always chewing. Your brother speaks that night, first time in days. Saw a crow land on the bread this morning, he mutters. Wouldn't touch it. You glance at the loaf on the table. Even crows know better. Aces no more. Historians note that bread during famines often became symbolic, not just food, but a test, a moral dilemma. To eat and risk sickness, or to starve and preserve dignity. Some villages ration bread only to the healthy. Others force the sick to eat first. As proof, you're not sick, not yet, but you're tired. Tired of weighing every bite, of sniffing the crust, of praying over flour, of second-guessing each chew like it might be your last. So you make a choice. You slice off a thin piece. You roast it over the fire on a stick, like a marshmallow from a world that doesn't exist yet. You smell it carefully. It pops and blisters slightly. The crust chars. Then you eat it. Nothing happens. You sit in silence. You wait. Your brother watches, not blinking. After a while, he eats a piece too. Neither of you speaks. And in the darkness of your cottage, with only the soft hiss of the fire and the smell of scorched bread in the air, you both wait to see what will happen next. Morning arrives slowly, like it's unsure if it should bother. The fire has burned out, and your breath hangs in little clouds above your face. You stretch cautiously, checking your limbs, your hands, your feet. No blisters, no burning, no twitching. Your brother's already awake, staring out the window. He hasn't spoken yet. The bread sits between you on the table, half eaten. It still smells faintly charred, but ordinary. You feel fine, mostly, but your fingers still ache. And your dreams were stranger than usual faces without mouths, loaves with wings, and someone whispering in Latin under your floorboards. You shake it off. Today, you fetch water early. The path to the well is muddy, but the birds are louder than they've been all week. A good sign, maybe, maybe not. At the well, you hear the latest news. The manor steward is sick. Now that turns heads. The steward doesn't eat rye. He eats wheat. Only wheat. His loaves come from the castle ovens. baked in brass pans, seasoned with saffron and thyme, and delivered warm by trembling hands. And still he's sick. Noble sick, of course. Quiet. Private. Behind the shutters. But word slips out. He hasn't walked in 2 days. His knees don't bend. He's speaking strangely, they say, and sweating through his robes. You can't help but smile. Just a little. Because for once, the sickness isn't just yours. For once, the line between noble and peasant blurs not with politics, but with bread. Historians love to talk about the differences in diet between social classes. Rich diets were heavy in meat, sugar, and wheat bread. Poor diets? Rye, barley, cabbage, and more rye. But when grain goes bad, it doesn't check for titles. Still, the nobles suffer differently. They can afford doctors. Even if the doctors prescribe leeches and boiled nettles, they come wrapped in clean linens with servants and prayers and the illusion of help. If you twitch, you're possessed. If they twitch, they're exhausted. But rumors are hard to silence. You hear it from the market boy how one noblewoman poured her soup over her bread, and it turned blue. How another heard flutes playing from the chimney. How one night at supper stabbed his own arm and said, "The crust is in me." Maybe none of it's true. Maybe all of it is. You walk past the manor gates that evening and catch a glimpse of a servant burying something near the outer wall. It's too large for a rat, too small for a person. You wonder if it's a loaf. The next day, the steward is gone, sent away, they say, to a healing place. No one explains where. You doubt they know. Your brother speaks again that night. He seems clearer. The fog in his voice has lifted. "Saw Marta today," he says. You pause mid-stir, ladling thin broth over what's left of the bread. She was sweeping the square. You blink. "She's out?" He nods. Didn't say a word. But her face looked like stone. You both eat in silence. The bread is stale, dry. It crumbles more than it chews. You dip it again. Pretend it tastes like anything. The difference between noble and peasant bread is clear in texture, yes, but not always in safety. You think about the steward, twitching behind velvet drapes. You think about the boy, barefoot in the grass, dancing without rhythm. You think about your own hand show, they still ache, even now. And for the first time, you wonder how many people are walking around with the sickness half-bloomed inside them. You look at your brother. He smiles. His teeth are dull but clean. "I think we'll be all right," he says. And you almost believe him. You pass the bakery again. The shutters are open. For the first time in weeks, the scent of fresh bread drifts across the village square. Not bitter, not sharp, but warm and yeasty and full. The kind of smell that makes you remember better times, when a loaf was just a loaf. Inside, the baker works in silence. Her daughter kneads dough beside her, sleeves rolled high. You don't step inside. No one does yet. But everyone notices. They're baking again. Word spreads quickly. Someone says they're using safe flour now. Another claims the priest personally inspected their sacks. A third swears the oven was scrubbed with wine and ash. You know better. It's not about new flour. It's about survival. Life must continue. Loaves must rise. You bake again too. You still use rye. You don't have wheat, but you dry the grain longer, grind it finer. You clean your bowl twice. You mark the top with a new sign, just a single line. A reminder. This one, you made carefully. Still, part of you wonders if it matters. Because here's the truth. You never really know. Even the best loaf can carry death. Even the safest oven can betray you. And yet you bake. You remember stories passed around the fire in late summer. About distant towns where entire communities danced into rivers, laughing until they drowned. You used to think those were myths. Now, you think they were simply hungry. Historians write about these events with careful words. Outbreak, incident, mass psychogenic illness. But you know the human part of the story. You lived it. You buried loaves like secrets. You watched a boy die, with his eyes wide open. You chew slower now. Each slice, a decision. Your brother's cough is gone. His eyes are brighter. He even hummed today while repairing the cart. You watched him butter a crust and eat it without flinching. A small miracle. Marta speaks again. Quietly. Only to some. She's changed. Not in ways you can describe. Just tighter. Like something in her folded in and stayed that way. The priest has taken to blessing every oven, every millstone, every sack of grain. It's become a rhythm, a ritual. Part fear, part hope. And the market has changed. Suddenly, wheat is precious. People whisper of smugglers, of secret wheat fields miles away, of noblemen hoarding sacks for their own sick beds. A few loaves appear in the square, golden and round, priced like silver. One woman trades her winter cloak for a roll she can barely lift. You don't chasa it. You stay with your rye. You just watch it more closely now. Smell it longer. Listen to the crust crack. One afternoon, you gather with your neighbors near the chapel. The priest has built a new stone table. It's for blessings only, he says. For bread. Not for judgment. Not for blame. He places 3 loaves on it and sprinkles them with water, whispering a line in Latin you don't recognize. Everyone nods. No one asks questions. No one edares. You return home that night and slice your loaf. The sound of the crust breaking is soft, not hollow. You chew slowly. The taste is earthy, sharp at first, then dull. You wait. Your brother eats too. Outside, the wind shifts. A dog barks once, then falls quiet. The clouds roll gently across a moon the color of pale flour. Tomorrow will come, and you will bake again. The road is dry today. Not dusty, not muddy, just dry. Your boots scuff along its surface as you carry a warm loaf under your arm, wrapped in linen, marked with the simple line you've begun to trust. A quiet breeze nudges the trees, and for the first time in many weeks, it doesn't feel like the world is warning you. You're headed home from the mill. Tom's eldest son actually smiled today. He asked how your brother was. You told him better, and it felt true. Not entirely, but enough. The sack of flour on your back rests lighter than usual, though that could be your imagination. It always feels lighter when there's some hope in it. You think about how far you've come, since the first loaf tingled your fingers and turned your sleep into a guessing game, since the boy danced, since the bread turned bitter, since the woman by the stream disappeared and the baker closed her shutters and the steward lost the use of his legs. Some of it still doesn't make sense. Historians will never agree on how much of it was ergot, and how much was famine, and how much was just fear playing puppet master with your thoughts. But that's fine. You don't need agreement. You just need a crust that doesn't bite back. And today's loaf? It smells good. Strong. Clean. You pass Marta on the way home. She's kneeling in her small garden, pulling weeds with bare fingers. She nods as you pass. No words. Just a nod. You nod back, because the words aren't needed anymore. Everyone understands. You turn down the path to your home. The fields beyond are waving gently in the breeze of fresh shoots of grain, already breaking through the dirt. This year will be better. Probably. Possibly. Maybe your brother's mending a chair when you arrive. He doesn't look up, just says, "It's a good day." And it is. You set the loaf on the table and slice it in half. The crust crackles gently. The inside is even. Not too dark, not too moist. You both eat a piece slowly, like it's a sacred thing. You chew, you swallow, you wait. And nothing happens. Not for an hour, not for the rest of the day, not that night. There's a comfort in small rituals, in the sweep of flour across the table, in the hiss of dough hitting hot stone, in the softness of bread that doesn't sting the tongue. The village hasn't forgotten. No one will forget. But the fear has softened. like bread that sat too long in broth. Still there, but easier to swallow. You sit outside after supper, under a sky dusted with stars, listening to the crickets sing. You survived. And tomorrow, you'll bake again. The night stretches long and quiet now, like a soft quilt draped gently across the hills of your village. The bread is gone. The oven is cold. But the air feels still and kind again, like it's stopped watching you quite so closely. You close your eyes, and all the hard edges begin to blur. The grain rustling in the fields becomes a lullaby. The creak near the mill turns to a whisper. Even the chapel bell, swinging slowly in the dark, seems less like a warning now and more like a heartbeat, steady, tired, and ready to rest. Your brother breathes evenly in the room beyond. The loaf you shared still sits on the table, crumbs scattered like stars across wood. No sickness, no burning, just a quiet fullness and the memory of chewing without fear. The shutters are closed. The hearth glows low. Outside, a breeze plays through the eaves with soft fingers. You're warm and safe, and tomorrow will come. Maybe there will be rye, maybe wheat, maybe just broth and quiet. But for now, your body is still. Your breath is slow. Your thoughts drift further from the fire, from the bread, from the dark things that once lived in your loaves. You are fed, you are home, and you can rest now. Sleep well, baker.